I've spent the past 3 years learning how to live without Michael. That doesn't mean I've been successful. Some days the house feels like a mausoleum, each room heavy with the ghost of our life together. His favorite mug still sits on the second shelf, even though I can't bring myself to use it. His wool cardigan hangs on the back of our bedroom chair, faintly carrying the scent of his cologne. I move through these rooms like a caretaker in a museum of someone else's existence. Ralph, our only son, has been absent from that museum for over a year. We hadn't spoken since that fight, when voices rose in the kitchen and years of unspoken resentments spilled out in a mess neither of us cleaned up. He stormed out, the door slam rattling the china cabinet. I stood at the window and watched him drive away, swearing I wouldn't chase him this time. I kept that promise, though it tasted like vinegar in my mouth every day afterward. So when my phone rang on Thursday afternoon and his name appeared on the screen, my first instinct was that something bad had happened. You don't go a year without speaking to your mother and then call for idle chit-chat. Mom? His voice was careful, neutral. Yes. My throat felt dry. I was wondering if you'd like to come over for dinner tomorrow. Me and Evelyn thought, well, maybe we could start fresh. Those last two words, start fresh, were so simple, but they hit me harder than I expected. Hope is a dangerous thing when you've been living without it. I'd like that, I said, trying to sound steady. We settled on 7 o'clock at their house. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen, my tea gone cold, feeling the smallest flicker of warmth in my chest. That evening, I let myself remember the days before Evelyn came into Ralph's life. He used to drop by unannounced, lean against the kitchen counter, and talk about everything from work to the weather. We'd chop vegetables together for stew or sit out in the garden watching the light fade. He used to tell me things. Then Evelyn happened. She wasn't openly hostile. Evelyn's style was subtler, forgetting to tell me about gatherings until the last minute or suggesting we meet at restaurants so I wouldn't have to strain myself cooking. Over time, the invitations dwindled, the phone calls thinned, and my son became more her husband than my child. But maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe this dinner meant she wanted to bridge the gap, too. On Friday, I spent more time getting ready than I had in years. I pulled my navy suit from the garment bag, the one I wore to Michael's retirement party, to Ralph's graduation, to the events that mattered. The fabric still held its shape, the shoulders neat, the seams precise. I pinned my hair in a soft twist, fastened the pearl earrings Michael gave me on our 10th anniversary, and, after some hesitation, dabbed on the perfume he used to love. I decided to bring a gift, a bottle of 12-year-old single malt. Ralph had developed a taste for whiskey in the past few years, and I wanted to give him something that spoke of thought, not obligation. The drive to their house took me through familiar streets lined with late summer blooms. The evening light turned everything gold, and I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face had aged in the past year, but there was still a spark in my eyes, a dangerous, foolish spark that believed in second chances. Evelyn answered the door. She was as put together as always, pale silk blouse, gold necklace, hair smooth and precise. Her smile was warm enough to pass for genuine. Lilu, you look lovely. Come in. Ralph appeared behind her, his eyes warmer than I'd seen in years. Hi, Mom. He hugged me, and I let myself lean into it for a moment before stepping back. The dining room was softly lit, a vase of white roses on the table. The scent of roasted chicken and herbs drifted from the kitchen. 3 places were set, the silverware gleaming, the wine glasses catching the light from the chandelier. We sat down, and for the first few minutes, it was almost easy. They asked about my garden. I complimented the meal. Ralph poured wine. Evelyn's laugh sounded lighter than I remembered, almost hopeful. And then my phone buzzed. I'd slipped it into my bag at my feet, more out of habit than expectation. I leaned down to check it, thinking it might be a delivery alert or a reminder I'd forgotten to turn off. The screen showed a message from an unknown number. Just one sentence. Leave the house immediately. Do not say anything to your son. I blinked, certain I'd misread it. The words were still there when I looked again, stark and cold against the soft glow of the table. My fork hovered in the air. Evelyn was telling a story about her office, Ralph nodding along, neither of them noticing the sudden chill in my bones. I read the message a second time, my mind spinning. Who would send me something like that? And why now, just as we were finding our way back to each other? I slipped the phone back into my bag, my heart thudding against my ribs. I tried to focus on the meal, but the words pulsed in the back of my mind like a warning siren I couldn't turn off. If it was a prank, it was cruel. If it wasn't, I took a sip of wine to steady my hands. Ralph was telling me about a home project he and Evelyn were starting, but his words were a distant hum. I smiled when expected, laughed politely, but every beat of my pulse whispered the same question. Should I obey the message? When I turned off the engine in front of Ralph and Evelyn's new place, I sat for a full 10 seconds, just looking. Last year, they were in a sensible two-bedroom on Hawthorne. This was a small kingdom with warm light blooming behind floor-to-ceiling windows, a drive that curved like a silk ribbon, and a front door big enough to have its own weather. A fountain threw water into the dusk in 3 polite arcs. Somewhere a discreet motor hummed. Gates, security, wealth. I'm not naive. I know promotions happen, markets turn, lucky breaks exist. But I also know my son's salary range and Evelyn's job title because before the fight we still talked about practical things. This house didn't pencil out. Not even with perfect credit and a handshake from God. The door opened before I could ring. Ralph crossed the threshold, all shoulders and that old familiar smile that made me forget he'd slammed a door in my face last year. Mom. He hugged me tight. You made it. I did, I said, clutching the bottle of whiskey I'd bought. My peace offering felt suddenly small in the high, slow air of the entryway. Evelyn stepped forward in a silk blouse the color of a pearl you'd keep in a safe. Lilu, welcome. She took the whiskey, turned it in her hands, approving the label like she'd picked it out herself. Perfect. Behind them, a woman appeared, late 30s, early 40s maybe, dark hair in a low bun, a navy dress that managed to be both plain and expensive. She carried a tray with 3 thin crystal flutes and a smile that only reached halfway. This is Mirabelle, Evelyn said. She keeps the house running. House manager, the woman corrected softly, in an accent that made her vowels warm. Most people say housekeeper, but I prefer manager. She offered me one of the flutes. Welcome, Mrs. Lilu. Our eyes met over the polished rim. Something flickered, concern? Warning? It lasted no more than a breath, but it left a tiny cold thumbprint under my ribs. Then her expression was polite again, the look folded up and put away. They ushered me in. The foyer swallowed my footsteps. The floors were so glossy I could see the chandeliers reflected like ghosts in the wood. A staircase floated upward without visible support. Off to the right, a glass-walled room displayed a piano the size of a small boat and shelves arranged in a way that said the books had been purchased by the yard. Wow, I heard myself say, which was not the sophisticated response I was going for. Ralph beamed. Crazy, right? We fell in love with it the second we walked in. When did you move? I asked, gentle as a hand on a sleeping cat. 3 months ago, Evelyn said. It's been a whirlwind. I wanted to ask how. Instead, I let them sweep me toward the dining room where the table glowed like a lacquered lake. 3 places, linen napkins folded into those little birds. White roses at the center. A pair of silver candlesticks so heavy they were probably registered as weapons. Mirabelle placed a plate of herb-dusted almonds between us, then vanished as if the walls had inhaled her. Evelyn poured wine Burgundy, the good kind that tastes like velvet and patience, and Ralph pulled out my chair, scraping a sound from the floor that was too human for this space. So, he said, settling, how's the garden? We bobbed over safe topics at first, my hydrangeas, his office renovation, Evelyn's new team. Somewhere between the salads and the roast chicken my earlier text message intruded on my thoughts, as if someone had left a window open and let in cold air. Leave the house immediately. Do not say anything to your son. I had not obeyed. I was here, smiling, because I wanted the museum of my life to have visitors again. The words thrummed like a second heartbeat anyway. Evelyn refilled my glass without asking. You still take just a finger of whiskey after dinner, don't you, Lilu? I blinked. I do. And no onions, right? Ralph added, lifting the cover from a dish of green beans that bore not a single pearl of the offending vegetable. It should have felt like care. Instead, the back of my neck went prickly. I'd never told Evelyn about the onions. That was Michael's joke, an old silly superstition. Onions jinx our good news. He used to remind restaurants, and I'd roll my eyes. Ralph knew, of course. But hearing it from Evelyn's mouth felt like a stranger humming my wedding song. They asked about my week, then eased toward money the way people do when they've rehearsed their lines. So Ralph said, aiming for light, landing on careful, have you thought any more about retiring from your consulting? It was a generous word for what I did now, helping old clients make sense of budgets, scheduling, the odd vendor. I like keeping busy. Of course, Evelyn said, sympathetic smile engaged. We just worry. It's stressful to shoulder those responsibilities alone. Mirabelle returned to exchange plates. Up close, I noticed the faintest bruise under her left sleeve where fabric met wrist. She moved like someone who had learned not to jostle the air. Everything's delicious, I told her. Thank you, she said. Her eyes slid to mine, an echo of that earlier look, quick, secretive, and then away. She left the room, and a soft latch clicked somewhere far down the hallway. Evelyn dabbed at her mouth. I met a woman the other day who moved into the sweetest retirement community, sunroom, garden plots, a shuttle. She said the best part was not having to worry about maintenance or paperwork. I took a drink. The wine blurred at the edges, smoothed things I should have kept sharp. Ralph jumped in. We're not saying now. Just, it's good to have a plan. Speaking of, do you remember what firm did Dad's will? And yours? He laughed too loud, then dialed it back. I might borrow that lawyer. For us. We've been organizing our documents, Evelyn said, nodding earnestly. It made me think about you. We want to make sure you're protected, Lilu. Protected. Such a kind word for a hand around a wrist. I gave them vague answers. Yes, everything was in order. Yes, Michael was thorough. No, I wasn't worried. I kept my voice pleasantly dull and wondered how Evelyn knew I preferred my salad dressing on the side, the chicken dark meat, the music low and instrumental. Even the thermostat hovered at the exact degree I keep my house on cool evenings. It's possible Ralph remembered, but it felt like someone had taken notes. I reached for the bread. The butter was the good kind, curled into little shells, salted just enough. You do not salt butter on accident. I ate it like a person starved of something other than food. The conversation took a brighter turn. Ralph told a story about a coworker who'd christened his new boat in a kiddie pool. I laughed at the right moments. Evelyn asked about my hydrangeas by name, Endless Summer, and I tried not to dwell on how she knew the variety I favored. Wine became whiskey. The 12-year I'd brought bloomed in my mouth. Apple, oak, the tiniest lick of smoke. It made me think of Michael in his armchair on quiet Fridays, telling me that flavor lives in time the way people live in houses. Maybe that's why I let the text recede to the edge of the table, tucked beneath napkins and candlelight, and the way Ralph kept squeezing my hand like this. This right here mattered. Mirabelle reappeared with a small plate of something lemon and sugar. When she set it down, her fingers brushed mine. It was a feather of a touch, an accident anyone else would have missed. She didn't look at me, but I felt a sliver of paper between our skin, slick as a secret. She withdrew. I palmed the sliver under the table, brought the linen napkin to my lap, unfolded, refold, masking the motion. The paper was no bigger than my thumb. One line, written in a hand careful enough to look like print. Please be cautious. My heart tapped once against the inside of my ribcage, hard enough to be audible to the flatware. I was sure. I lifted my eyes. Mirabelle was already gone, a door side shut. The lemon dessert glowed like an apology. Everything okay? Ralph asked. Perfect, I said, and meant it, because for a minute I had both things. My son's warm hand on mine and the knowledge that I wasn't crazy for hearing danger in a room that smelled like rosemary and reconciliation. Evelyn raised her glass. To new beginnings, she said. We clinked. The sound was bright and sweet and lasted just long enough to drown out the second vibration of my phone in the bag at my feet. I didn't look. I let the atmosphere do its work. The alcohol softened the edges of my worry. The roses leaned toward the candles. Even the house, with all its gleaming surfaces, seemed to exhale. For the first time in a year, I allowed myself to imagine that we could fix this, that the impossible house could have a reasonable explanation, that people, like wine, can deepen if given time, and not all flavors hide smoke. Later, I would count every detail and find teeth in each one. But that night, under the hush of expensive air and my son's hopeful smile, I let myself relax. I let the warning sink beneath the tablecloth. I didn't know then that by trusting the softness, I was stepping closer to whatever required a stranger and then a house manager to tell me to run. The crystal chandelier above us shimmered in the soft light, casting a golden glow over the dinner table. I was just about to take another sip of wine when my phone, lying face down beside my plate, buzzed. I wouldn't have checked it normally. Ralph hated when I looked at my phone during meals, but something in me told me to turn it over. One new message. From an unknown number. Leave the house immediately. Do not say anything to your son. For a few seconds, I thought it was some tasteless spam. But my heart reacted before my brain could form a thought. It began pounding so loudly I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I glanced up. Ralph was in the middle of telling a story about a business trip. Evelyn was smiling in that carefully polite way of hers, and Mirabelle, the housekeeper, was quietly refilling the bread basket. Nobody seemed to notice my frozen expression. I took a slow breath, forcing my face into something neutral. My hands itched to fumble with the phone again, to demand answers from that unknown number, but I didn't dare. I think I'll just freshen up, I said casually, pushing back my chair. Evelyn glanced at me. Down the hall, first door on the left, she said, her tone sweet, but her eyes unreadable. I nodded, but instead of turning left toward the guest bathroom, I made my way past the dining room toward the kitchen. Mirabelle was there, arranging some kind of elaborate fruit platter. She looked up as I entered. Our eyes met, and in that moment I thought I saw something flicker there. Concern? Pity? Warning? But she didn't say a word. She simply stepped aside, letting me pass. The back door was just beyond the pantry. I eased it open, wincing at the faint creak of the hinge. The cool night air hit me, sharp and bracing. I stepped out, closing the door as quietly as possible behind me. Once outside, I didn't allow myself to run, but I walked quickly down the stone path, through a gate, and onto the dimly lit street. My breath was coming faster now, my heels clicking against the pavement like a metronome of panic. I pulled out my phone and ordered a car. It arrived within minutes, the driver giving me only a curious glance as I slid into the back seat. Where to? He asked. I gave my home address automatically, though I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to be there either. As the car pulled away from Ralph's mansion, I unlocked my phone again and stared at the unknown number. My thumb hovered for a moment before I hit call. It rang once, twice. On the third ring, a man's voice answered, low, urgent. Lilu, thank God you listened. You're in danger. They were going to. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror as my grip on the phone tightened. Who's this? I demanded. Not here, the voice said quickly. You need to get somewhere safe. Don't go home. They know more about you than you think. And it's not just about money, it's about what your husband left behind. The line went dead. I sat back, pulse racing, the city lights flashing past in a blur. What had I just walked away from? The voice on the other end didn't waste a second. Lilu, listen very carefully. You are not safe. Your son owes a huge debt, hundreds of thousands, to men you do not want to meet. They're not the kind of people who send polite letters. They're the kind who settle accounts in cash or blood. My breath caught in my throat. Debt? Ralph's never mentioned he wouldn't. The voice cut me off, sharp and certain. Because the moment you knew, you'd ask why he lives in a mansion he can't possibly afford, why his accounts are empty, and why every so-called friend of his wears a watch worth more than your car. He's desperate, Lilu. Desperate people do things you never think they're capable of. I gripped the phone tighter. The car's gentle motion suddenly felt like a trap, each passing streetlight flashing a metronome of dread across my lap. You left just in time, the voice continued. That dinner wasn't about family. It was about you. They had a plan. Your son and his wife were going to serve you whiskey with something added to it, Maverick's all. The word was unfamiliar, but it sounded like something that belonged in a lab, not a crystal glass. What is it? It's a designer drug, the voice said. Colorless, tasteless, and once it's in your system, it makes you open, suggestible. They could tell you the sky was green, and you'd sign a statement to prove it. No hallucinations, no drama, just a dangerous, quiet compliance. And they wanted me to sign something. They have the papers ready. Transfer of your business, power of attorney, liquidation of your investments, even the deed to your house. All dressed up to look like something harmless. Tax adjustments, trust updates, routine legal housekeeping. Under Mavericksol, you'd think you were doing the right thing. You'd feel good about it. By morning, you'd own nothing but the clothes on your back. My pulse thudded in my ears. How do you know this? Because I've seen them do it before. Not just your son, others in his debt circle. It's a scheme they run when a debtor has someone wealthy in the family. Your son owes them too much to pay in cash, so they told him to bring them you. I felt a sickness rise in me, heavy and hot. Every kind word from Ralph at that table, every careful question about my retirement and my will, replayed in my mind like scenes from a play I'd thought was real. Why are you telling me? I asked. Because someone inside that house reached out. They couldn't call you directly, it would be too risky. So they came to me. She said you'd be polite, reserved, but observant. That you'd notice details others missed. Mirabelle. The paper pressed into my hand flashed in my memory. Please be cautious. Her steady eyes, the small bruise under her sleeve, the way she seemed to move around Evelyn like a shadow avoiding the sun. She was right to warn you, the voice said. But now you need to act, and fast. Do not go home. If they don't find you tonight, they'll try again, maybe with something more direct. Call your bank and freeze every account. Contact your lawyer and make sure no one can access your finances or property without you in person. That includes Ralph. I stared out the window, my reflection ghostly in the glass. The city slid past in ribbons of neon and shadow. You think he'd hurt me? I asked, almost whispering. I think, the voice said slowly, that he's in a place where your well-being is secondary to his survival. If signing away everything kept him breathing one more day, he'd convince himself it was for the best. The words landed like stones in my chest. I don't want to believe you, I admitted. I know. But wanting to believe someone doesn't make them worthy of it. There was a pause, then, quieter. You have less time than you think, Lilu. Protect yourself. Tonight. Before I could form another question, the line went dead. The car's interior felt too small, the air stale. I slipped the phone into my lap, staring at my hands. They were shaking. My son's hands had once fit inside mine, sticky with jam from his favorite toast. I'd held those hands steady when he learned to write his name. I'd clapped for them when they held his university diploma. And now, those same hands had been ready to guide a pen over papers that would strip me of everything I had left. I didn't cry. I couldn't. The tears would come later, maybe, when the immediate danger wasn't pressing down on me like a stone slab. For now, I had to think. And I had to move. Somewhere behind me, in that shining house full of roses and candlelight, Mirabelle had slipped me a warning at great personal risk. And if the voice was telling the truth, it might be the only reason I was still free and still in possession of my life. I leaned forward to the driver. Change of address, I said, giving him the name of a hotel on the other side of town. If Ralph was willing to sell me out to save himself, then I couldn't afford to give him even a shadow of a trail. The hotel lobbies smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee grounds, the sort of neutral comfort that promised nothing and demanded less. The clerk had just handed me a key card when I stopped, staring at the dull gold numbers on the plastic. I could check in. I could lock the door and curl up in anonymity until morning. I could protect myself. But then what? If the voice was telling the truth, Ralph and Evelyn wouldn't stop at me. If this was a pattern, they would find another target, a friend, a colleague, maybe even one of my late husband's old business partners. And if I ran without proof, it would be my word against theirs. I set the key card on the counter and stepped aside to an armchair near the front windows, pulling my phone from my bag. My hands didn't shake this time. The number for the local precinct rang twice before a calm female voice answered. "This is Lilu Harrow," I said. I need to report an attempted financial crime. I have reason to believe my son and daughter in law are involved. I have the address. I gave them Ralph's new mansion, my voice steady as I outlined the plan I'd been warned about: the drugged whiskey, the staged documents, the debts to dangerous people. The officer didn't interrupt, but I could hear her typing. "We can send a unit immediately," she said when I finished. "Are you in the house now?" I replied. I left. I'm going back. If I'm right, they'll try to resume the setup, and I'll make sure you have enough to work with when you arrive. There was a pause. "Ma'am, that's risky." "We can intercept." "No," I said. "If they suspect anything, they'll hide the evidence. Let me keep them talking until you're there." 10 minutes. 10 minutes, she confirmed. "Stay on the line if you can." The drive back felt shorter, though my stomach coiled tighter with every street we passed. The mansion came into view, its glowing windows and perfect symmetry, like the face of someone too composed to be trusted. Evelyn opened the door before I could knock, her expression a careful blend of relief and mild reproach. "Lilu, we were worried. You said you were just stepping out. I needed some air," I said simply, brushing past her into the foyer. Ralph appeared from the dining room, hands spread like he meant to hug me. "Mom, we thought something happened." "You didn't answer your phone reception," I said with a faint smile. "And I didn't want to interrupt the evening. I hope I didn't miss dessert." Evelyn's laugh was thin. "We saved you some." But there was something off. The dining table was exactly as I'd left it, candles still burning, wine glasses still full, but the sideboard where the whiskey had been displayed was bare. In its place was a silver fruit bowl that hadn't been there before. I caught a flicker in Ralph's eyes as he followed my gaze. Too quick for most to notice, but I'd known that face since it was 3 days old. They'd hidden something during my absence. I let them steer me back to the table, every muscle in my body tuned to the ticking clock. 8 minutes. So I said lightly, "Where were we?" Ralph, you were telling me about your office renovations." He picked up the thread too easily, his hands moving as he talked, but his eyes kept darting toward Evelyn, as though checking cues. She smiled, poured me fresh wine, her fingers careful around the glass. I didn't touch it. "Mirabelle," I said suddenly, "could I trouble you for a little tea instead? The whiskey might be too strong for me tonight." There was the smallest pause before she answered from the doorway, "Of course, Mrs. Harrow." Her eyes met mine for an instant, enough to confirm she understood. 7 minutes. I asked about Evelyn's work, her sweet retirement community idea, and her expression warmed again, just enough to sell the illusion. Underneath, I could see the calculation, how to guide me back toward whatever they had planned before my little walk. 6 minutes. I told them about the hydrangeas, about Michael's stubborn habit of buying the wrong mulch on purpose just to annoy me. I laughed, they laughed, the air grew sticky with false ease. 5 minutes. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement near the long drive, just a shift in the shadows beyond the front windows. For minutes. "Do you remember," I said, leaning forward as if sharing a secret, "that fishing trip when you were 12, Ralph?" His smile faltered for the first time that night. Sure. Yeah." 3 minutes. Evelyn excused herself to check on dessert, her heels clicking over the marble. I heard a faint clink of glass from somewhere in the kitchen. 2 minutes. I kept Ralph engaged, pressing him for details about his work, about a new client, about anything that forced him to keep talking. 1 minute. Then headlights swept briefly across the windows. A pair of dark shapes moved up the walk. I smiled into my wine glass, though I hadn't taken a single sip all evening. Showtime. Evelyn came back from the kitchen carrying the whiskey bottle like a prize. Her smile was taut at the edges, too polished to be genuine. She set the bottle on the table with a little flourish and fetched 3 crystal tumblers from the sideboard. "I realized," she said lightly, "that we never made a proper toast tonight. And what's a reconciliation without one?" I watched her hands, steady, deliberate, as she poured. The golden liquid caught the candlelight, but it wasn't the color that made my chest tighten. As she tilted the bottle over my glass, I caught a shimmer in the liquid, a faint cloudiness that didn't belong. Tiny pale specks hovered near the surface before slowly vanishing into the swirl. Not ice. Not dust. She slid the glass toward me, her eyes never leaving my face. To family, she said, raising her own. Old wounds mended and new beginnings. Ralph mirrored her gesture. His eyes, however, were locked on my glass, not my face. I wrapped my fingers around the tumbler, but didn't lift it to my lips. Oh, you've just reminded me of something, I said, letting my tone soften as if nostalgia had caught me by surprise. Ralph, do you remember the year you tried to bake a cake for your father's birthday? He blinked. Maybe. You were 11, I said, smiling faintly. You mixed up the sugar and the salt. The thing came out like a brick. But you were so determined to make it right that you stayed up until midnight baking another one. Michael ate both just so you wouldn't feel bad. I thought he'd burst. Evelyn's smile twitched. That's sweet, Lilu, but maybe we should, and do you remember, I cut in smoothly, how the second one wasn't much better because you used baking soda instead of baking powder? I laughed gently, drawing the moment out, painting the kitchen in words, the smell of burnt crust, the flour on Ralph's hair, Michael's booming laugh filling the house. My glass sat untouched between my hands. I tilted it idly, letting the light catch the surface, the suspicious flecks just barely visible if you knew to look. Evelyn's eyes flicked to the clock. Ralph shifted in his chair, running a hand over his jaw. The muscles in his forearm tightened every time my glass swayed, but didn't rise to my lips. They wanted me to drink. And the longer I stalled, the more the veneer of casual civility peeled away. So I said brightly, "How's that new office project coming along, Ralph?" You were saying something about a big redesign. He answered too quickly, his voice just a shade too high. Evelyn refilled her own glass, though she didn't drink. I leaned back, deliberately slow, and glanced toward the foyer. I thought, just for a heartbeat, that I heard the faint rumble of tires on gravel outside. Maybe we should move to the living room, Evelyn suggested. It's more comfortable for a nightcap. Or, I said, we could stay right here. I've always liked the formality of a dining table for good conversation. And I have another story for you. This one about Michael and that fishing trip when Ralph was 12. Ralph's smile tightened. Mom, maybe later. Oh, it's a short one, I interrupted and launched into it. How Michael had forgotten the bait, but still managed to come home with 2 trout because the shopkeeper took pity on him. Every detail another second bought. Evelyn was no longer smiling. Her eyes flicked toward the front door again, and Ralph's hand twitched against the table. Then 3 sharp, heavy knocks rattled the door. The room froze. Another set of knocks followed, louder this time, along with a firm voice. Police. Open the door. The air turned solid. Evelyn's head whipped toward Ralph, who stared at her like a man caught in the middle of a nightmare. When the third knock came, it was accompanied by the sound of the door opening and boots on marble. 2 uniformed officers stepped into the dining room, their expressions unreadable. Ralph Harrow? Evelyn Harrow? We have a warrant for your arrest. What? Evelyn's voice pitched upward. This is insane. On what grounds? Ralph demanded, but his voice wavered. The officers moved with quiet efficiency, hands guided behind backs, cold metal cuffs snapping shut, the low murmur of Miranda rights recited over Evelyn's protests. I stayed in my chair, my hands folded neatly in my lap, the untouched whiskey glass gleaming between us. Evelyn's gaze flicked to it as they led her away. For a moment, something unguarded passed over her face, frustration, maybe even fear. The front door shut behind them, leaving the room in sudden, heavy silence. The roses in the centerpiece leaned toward the candles, as if nothing had happened at all. For the first time that night, I let myself breathe. The dining room was still warm with candlelight, but the air felt stripped bare, like a stage after the curtain has dropped and the audience has gone home. 2 officers remained with me while the others moved Ralph and Evelyn toward the foyer. Radios crackled. The faint metallic bite of handcuffs clinked in the hall. One officer, broad-shouldered with calm, steady eyes, stepped forward. Mrs. Harrow, you mentioned evidence? Without a word, I slid the whiskey glass across the table. This was poured for me just before you arrived. I didn't drink it. My voice was low but sure. There are visible particles in the liquid. It's a drug called Mavrixol, makes people highly suggestible. The plan was to get me to sign over my assets under the influence. He examined the glass without touching it, then pulled on gloves and held it up to the light. The specks floated lazily in the amber liquid like pollen in a sunbeam. "We'll have this sent to the lab immediately," he said. "If it tests positive, it's damning physical evidence." From the foyer came the even, clipped voice of another officer, "Ralph Harrow, Evelyn Harrow. You are under arrest for attempted poisoning, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of an elderly person." The words struck the air with the weight of a verdict. Evelyn's head snapped up, her voice sharp with disbelief. "No, you don't understand. This wasn't about hurting anyone. We owe money. A lot of money. To people who, they don't forgive debts. They told us we had no choice." I walked to the doorway, stopping just close enough to see her face. "There's always a choice," I said evenly. "You could have told me. You could have asked for help. But you didn't. You decided the solution was to drug me in my own son's home and take everything I had left." Her mouth opened, then closed again. She looked down at the polished marble under her heels. Ralph stood beside her, his hands cuffed, his eyes flicking between me and the officers. "Mom," he started, voice trembling, "I didn't want this. I swear to you, I was trying to protect you. It was Evelyn's plan." A detective stepped forward holding an evidence bag. Inside was a neatly folded sheaf of papers. "We found these in a study. Power of attorney transfer. Property deed reassignment. Full liquidation of your investment accounts. All prepared," and he tapped the plastic bag, "already notarized last week under your son's request." Ralph's mouth opened, but no words came. His shoulders rounded inward, his head dropping slightly, like a boy caught lying for the first time. "You were ready to go through with it," the detective said flatly. "We have emails to the notary and text messages between you and Evelyn discussing the timing." "It wasn't supposed to be like this," Ralph muttered, but the conviction in his voice had drained away. I took a slow step toward him. "You think I don't know desperation? I buried your father while carrying debts neither of us deserved. I scraped to pay for your education, for the roof over your head. And you stand here telling me that the only way out was to destroy me." His eyes glistened, but he didn't answer. The officers moved in, guiding them both toward the open door. Evelyn's jaw was tight, her gaze fixed on the floor. Ralph glanced at me once, a flicker of something, guilt, shame, or maybe just the realization that this was final. Cool night air swept into the foyer as they were led down the front steps. Patrol car doors opened, the metallic slam echoing through the house. The sound of the engine starting was oddly muffled, as though the night itself wanted to swallow it. I stood in the doorway until the tail lights vanished. When I turned back toward the dining room, the roses still leaned toward the candlelight, their petals half-shadowed in gold. The wine glasses caught the flicker of flame, glinting like nothing had happened. But everything had. And for the first time in a long time, the air in that house felt clean. The interview room was small and unremarkable, pale walls, a single table bolted to the floor, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang and rang before someone picked up. I sat across from Detective Harris, a man with weathered features and eyes that looked like they'd seen every version of human betrayal. A small digital recorder sat between us. He pushed a fresh legal pad toward himself and clicked his pen. "Let's start from the beginning, Mrs. Harrow," he said. So I did. I told him about the phone call from Ralph after a year of silence. About how he'd said he wanted to start fresh, how I'd let that fragile hope grow enough to bring me to their home with a bottle of good whiskey in my hands. I recounted every moment I could remember, the suspiciously personal questions at dinner, the texture of the liquid in my glass, the anonymous message on my phone. I even described Mirabelle's steady gaze in the kitchen and the faint rustle of paper she'd slipped into my palm. Harris asked pointed questions, the time I arrived, the exact phrasing of certain conversations, whether I'd noticed if anyone handled my glass when I wasn't looking. I answered as precisely as I could. My voice stayed steady, but my hands stayed clasped together on the table, fingers interlocked so tightly they ached. When I'd finished, he set his pen down. "Mrs. Harrow, I'm going to be blunt with you. Your daughter-in-law, Evelyn Harrow, is looking at 15 to 20 years in prison. Minimum." Attempted poisoning, conspiracy to commit fraud, and elder abuse are all serious felonies. 15 to 20 years. It wasn't the number that rattled me, it was picturing Evelyn, immaculate and smug, stripped of her jewelry, wearing prison khaki. And my son. My voice came out quieter than I intended. If he cooperates fully, testifies against Evelyn, gives us evidence on the debts and the moneylenders, he might avoid prison. Probation, restitution, maybe even supervised release. But if he doesn't, Harris's mouth pressed into a flat line. Then the same sentencing range applies to him. I looked down at my folded hands. The idea of Ralph in prison made something deep in me flinch, but so did remembering the feel of that whiskey glass in my hand, the one they'd meant to drug. Harris must have seen my gaze drift because he turned toward the small window in the door. From there, the holding cells were visible down the hall. Evelyn paced in hers like a caged animal, arms folded tight, tucking in quick bursts through the bars to Ralph in the next cell. Even separated by metal, they were leaning toward each other, their heads angled just enough to keep their conversation private. Evelyn's hands moved in small, sharp gestures, her lips curling in what might have been a smile or a snarl. Ralph nodded along, his eyes flicking toward me just once before darting away. "They're still talking," I said. "They'll keep talking," Harris replied. In cases like this, we see the same patterns. One tries to shift blame to the other, or they work together to manipulate the victim into softening their statement. You're their only way out now. And if they think there's a chance you'll protect them, they'll press it. Hard. I watched Evelyn touch the bars between them as she spoke, her expression almost tender. Ralph leaned in, listening like a boy taking instructions from an older sibling. I wondered if he even realized he was doing it, or if he'd been following someone else's lead for so long that he'd forgotten how to stand on his own. The detective's voice cut through my thoughts. "If either of them asks to meet with you, even just to talk things over, do not go without counsel. Don't take phone calls from unknown numbers, and don't let them into your home." I've seen elderly parents persuaded to recant their statements out of guilt. Don't give them that chance. I tore my eyes away from the cells. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel conflicted. I felt finished. Whatever love or loyalty I'd once relied on with Ralph had been eaten away by his choices. Evelyn had lit the match, but he'd been willing to hold it to the fuse. I stood, smoothing the wrinkles from my jacket. "I won't be manipulated again, detective. Not by them." Harris gave a single nod, the kind of acknowledgement given when words aren't necessary. Through the narrow glass, I caught one last glimpse of my son. His head was bent toward Evelyn's, his hands clasped between his knees. I let the image burn into my mind, not as a wound, but as a reminder. I turned away and walked out of the station into the cool night air. The streets smelled faintly of rain. For the first time in years, I breathed without waiting for the other shoe to drop. I had been manipulated for the last time. The call came just as I was clearing the breakfast dishes. An unfamiliar number. My first instinct was to let it ring. Too many unknown numbers in recent days had carried voices I didn't want to hear. But something in me hesitated, and I answered. "Mrs. Harrow?" The voice was soft, tentative, with a faint accent. "Yes, it's Mirabelle. I hope it's all right," I called. I set the dish towel down. "Of course. I've been thinking about you since that night." There was a long pause. "I wanted to explain," she said. "I didn't want you to wonder why I warned you." "Go on," I said gently. She took a slow breath, as though steadying herself. 2 nights before the dinner, I was upstairs in a study. They'd left some glasses there after a meeting, and I was dusting. Ralph and Evelyn came in. They didn't notice me at first. My back was to them, and they assumed I couldn't understand English well enough to follow their conversation. Her voice grew tighter. "They spoke about you as if you were an object. Not a person." Evelyn said, "She's soft, she'll do whatever we need." Ralph laughed. "They talked about how lonely you must be, how you'd never suspect a thing. They discussed the whiskey, when to pour it, how to make it look like part of the evening. And Evelyn, she called you a burden they had to get rid of." Something in my chest pulled tight. "They said all this, knowing you were in the room?" "They didn't see me at first," she said, "and when they did, Evelyn switched to talking about curtains and paint. I knew it was a performance, but they thought they were safe because I was the help. The bitterness in her tone was sharp but controlled. I understood every word. And you decided to warn me. Yes, but I didn't know if they were watching me, so I waited until the moment was right. When you asked for tea, I knew Evelyn wouldn't follow me to the kitchen. That's when I slipped you the note. I could see it in my mind, her calm face, the quiet weight of that folded scrap in my palm, the way her eyes had held mine just long enough to make sure I understood. They think I'm invisible, she continued, but I see more than they imagine. And I couldn't stand by and watch them hurt you. I let the silence sit for a moment, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then I said, Mirabelle, I owe you more than a thank you. I have a proposition for you. She sounded startled. For me? Yes. I own a restaurant downtown, Harrow's Table. We've been looking for a manager. Someone reliable, organized, who pays attention to details and can keep a team running smoothly. It's a salaried position with good benefits and room to grow. There was a pause on the other end, the faint sound of her exhaling. Mrs. Harrow, I don't know what to say. I've I've only ever had jobs where people look past me, where I'm not supposed to be heard. No one's ever trusted me with something like this. I trust you, I said simply. You've already proven you notice what matters and that you'll act when it counts. Those are the kind of instincts I need in my business. Her voice trembled slightly. If I take it, I'll do my best. Always. I know you will. When we hung up, I stayed by the kitchen window for a long time, watching the street outside. The trees were bare, their branches black against the winter sky, but there was a certain beauty in that starkness. A promise that new leaves would come. In the space of a single conversation, I felt something I hadn't sensed before Michael died, a flicker of belief that people could still surprise me for the better. Trust was fragile, but it wasn't gone. And maybe, just maybe, it was ready to grow again. The key turned smoothly in the lock. When I stepped inside, the house greeted me with a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in years. Not the brittle, watchful silence of tension, but the deep quiet of a space that belonged to me again. I slipped off my coat, hung it on the stand, and wandered toward the kitchen. The refrigerator light spilled out in a square of cold blue when I opened the door. My eyes went immediately to the photographs, little rectangles of captured time held up by mismatched magnets. The first showed Ralph as a teenager, his awkward smile under a mop of hair he hated but I loved. Next to it, he stood with Evelyn at a beach, both grinning at the camera with that peculiar smugness of people who believe they've already won. Another picture, taken last Christmas, had them in matching sweaters, holding champagne flutes, their eyes locking just over the rim as though sharing a private joke. I stared at them for a long moment before reaching up. One by one, I slid each photo from beneath its magnet. The paper was cool against my fingers, the edges slightly curled. I didn't tear them. There was no satisfaction for me in destruction. Instead, I carried them to a small drawer in the sideboard and placed them inside, closing it firmly. Out of sight, out of daily reach. When I returned to the refrigerator, only one photo remained. It was of Mirabelle, taken last summer at a small staff gathering I'd hosted for the restaurant. She was laughing at something off camera, a paper plate in one hand, her other hand mid-gesture. Her eyes were bright, her smile wide, the kind of genuine joy that doesn't need rehearsing. It felt right that she was the only one left looking back at me from that door. I crossed to the desk in the corner, pulled my leather-bound calendar toward me, and flipped to the coming week. In the Saturday square, I wrote in neat, deliberate letters. Meeting with Mirabelle, new beginning. I let my pen rest there for a moment. The ink sank into the paper, and I thought about how rare it is, at my age, to truly start fresh with someone. But that's what it was, a start. The phone on the counter buzzed, jolting me from my thoughts. A message from Detective Harris, court date set. We'll need your testimony. I read it twice, then typed back, understood. I'll be there. When I set the phone face down, the room seemed to breathe with me. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the kitchen clock, ordinary sounds I hadn't noticed in years because I'd been living in a constant hum of unease. I walked slowly through the downstairs rooms, touching the edges of tables, the backs of chairs, the frames of paintings Michael had chosen. No footsteps behind me, no eyes on me but my own. Upstairs, I turned down the bed, smoothing the quilt with slow, deliberate strokes. The air was cool and faintly scented with lavender from the sachet I kept in the linen closet. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while, staring out at the darkened street. Somewhere down the block, a porch light flicked on, spilling gold across the sidewalk. A neighbor's cat crossed the lawn, tail high. My body felt tired in the best way, tired enough for real rest, not the restless, shallow dozing I'd been living on. I slid under the quilt and lay still, listening to the house settle. It's a strange truth, I thought, that love and protection are never more needed than when the danger comes from those who should offer them most. It's an even stranger truth that survival sometimes means choosing who gets to stay in your life, even when that choice hurts. Tonight, I had chosen. The trial didn't last as long as I'd feared. Evelyn's lawyers tried to argue duress, debts, threats, impossible pressure, but the evidence was heavy and the jury wasn't swayed. The toxicology report on the whiskey, the notarized property transfer papers, the text messages, it was all too much to explain away. She was sentenced to 17 years in prison. Ralph took the plea deal. He testified in detail against Evelyn, naming the moneylenders, explaining the plan. In return, the judge gave him 5 years probation, mandatory financial restitution, and barred him from managing or accessing any of my accounts. He didn't look at me when the sentence was read. I didn't attend every day of the trial. I didn't need to. But I was there for the verdict, sitting in the same seat each time, Mirabelle at my side. She never asked why I wanted her there. She simply showed up, her quiet presence steady and grounding. When it was over, I didn't feel triumphant. Just finished. Like a door had finally closed that I'd been holding open far too long. 3 months later, Harrow's table was buzzing on a Friday evening. Mirabelle moved between tables with a clipboard in hand, checking in on the waitstaff, adjusting a table setting here, exchanging a few words with the chef there. She had a gift for reading the room, the way people were leaning in, laughing, deciding whether to order dessert. From my seat at the corner table, I watched her handle a double booking crisis without raising her voice once. The couple who'd arrived to find their table taken left smiling, a voucher for a free meal in hand. When she returned to my table, I handed her a coffee. "You're a natural." She smiled, but there was a trace of disbelief in her eyes. "I never thought I'd be here. Not just a missed job, but trusted like this." "You earned it," I said. "And you've reminded me that trust can still be worth giving." For a moment, the noise of the dining room faded, and it was just the two of us, two women who had both been underestimated in different ways, now standing in the light of something we'd built together. She went back to work, and I stayed a little longer, sipping my coffee and letting the warmth settle into me. Life wasn't perfect. There were still court dates for the restitution, still letters from Ralph I hadn't answered. But the restaurant was thriving, my home was peaceful, and for the first time in a long while, I felt my days were my own. And as I watched Mirabelle greet a table with that unguarded, genuine smile, I knew I'd been right to write new beginning in my calendar. It hadn't just been a note. It had been a promise. And for the first time in years, I would sleep without fear.